After years of the Nintendo Switch 1, Nintendo has finally released the long-awaited sequel to that system, one of their best-selling and probably will end up being their best-selling device of all time, the Nintendo Switch 1, with the Nintendo Switch 2. We finally have this system in our hands, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over a comprehensive first impressions of the Nintendo Switch 2, the pros, the cons, positives, negatives, good and bad, and everything that I love about this tiny yet big little system overall, because there's a lot to go over. I'm going to break it down with the system build itself, in addition to the features, eShop, games, and kind of go over the future of what we could expect. I will probably be re-reviewing the Nintendo Switch 2 every single, I would say, like half year or so. So we'll kind of go over what they've added, other games and different things, just to see the added value of the system and overall, should you pick one up or not. So let's go ahead and first start off with the build of the system. The Nintendo Switch 2 is a big boy. It is definitely bigger than the Nintendo Switch 1. It has pretty much an inch bigger on the screen from the Nintendo Switch OLED, and the Joy-Cons itself are bigger, the system itself is bigger, but the profile is not. It is essentially the same. So if you like the thin profile of holding the Nintendo Switch 1 or the Switch OLED, you're going to be comfortable with this here. Now, with the bigger Joy-Cons, it does give you a little bit better feel on the system, at least if you have big hands like myself. So I do like the way that it feels playing the system over the Nintendo Switch version 1 or version 2, which is pretty much the same, just different battery on those ones. And then the Nintendo Switch OLED, which is a bit bigger. Obviously, the Nintendo Switch Lite players out there, this is going to be significantly bigger, so keep that in mind if you plan on getting one, or of course, if you're playing it right now and if the feel is not quite on, that's pretty much what's going on here. Now, when it comes to the screen itself, the screen is not a OLED screen, which is definitely unfortunate overall, but at the same time, it's still a really high quality screen from what I've played. It's a large, vivid 7.9-inch LCD touchscreen that does support HDR and up to 120 frames per second. Significantly better specs outside of not having an OLED than what Nintendo's done before in the past. So I do enjoy the size of the screen. Now, the screen does have some bezels on there, and I thought that might be an issue when I first started playing, but the screen size is so big on the system, can't really tell too much when you're playing the games. There's just so much screen, there's so much game that it covers when you're playing, and you're holding it somewhat close to your eyes just like this, so you don't really have an issue with the bezels. I thought it would be an issue, but it's not. Now, another thing that really just sticks out from the screen and the Joy-Cons, which we'll get into and all that, is the build quality. The build quality of this seems significantly better than the Nintendo Switch 1, definitely better than the Switch Lite, definitely better, and I would say a more premium build of the Nintendo Switch OLED. The OLED felt pretty good in your hands, but the Joy-Cons, the build of the system, the matte type of feel is just a way better, I would just say, overall build quality over what we got with the Nintendo Switch 1. The build quality on this is very nice. The Joy-Cons feel premium, they feel better. You don't have the system like you had before, where it was essentially like a rail system to where it can feel kind of loose. These fit pretty flush and they stick on. They are magnets, and essentially you just go like that. You pop them right off and then you go ahead and put them right back on. It's a very easy and simple system to really just get on and off overall. The L, R, Z, R, Z, L, all of the buttons feel better. They feel a bit more thick and plush when it comes to the quality of the build and everything. And the kickstand is a little bit different from the Nintendo Switch OLED, but it's still, I would say, a good kickstand. And even then, you might be able to put things, I guess, if you wanted to, right in between here if you felt like doing that. So I don't know why you would, but if you felt like doing it, you could. So overall, I would have to say the build quality, the system itself, everything with it feels premium and nice. This is a very well done system. They essentially took what was great about the Nintendo Switch 1 and said, hey, look, we're going to rebuild pretty much all that from just the feel of it overall. Now, another thing that I have to talk about are these analog sticks, and we're going to get to the Nintendo Switch 2 Pro controller in just a bit, but these analog sticks, they call them the smooth gliding sticks. man, they feel great to play. If you're playing Mario Kart Portable, you feel like you're never really going to have a missed, I would say, movement or anything. There's no friction really in between the analog sticks, and that's going to be super important for a racing game like Mario Kart, where precise movement is definitely needed to dodge green shells or boost that of the way or hit a rail grind or something like that. So I really enjoy these analog sticks on the Nintendo Switch 2. They are the best that Nintendo's done. Still have no analog triggers overall, but I'll be honest, just for me personally, I like the digital triggers more because I don't play as many shooters or racing games where you need to pull like and have it to where, you know, like you're trying to slightly accelerate or something. Mario Kart, you're always just going full blast or hitting the brake tap or something like that. So for me, for fighting games or for action RPGs or for platformers, it fits really well for that. For the games that I usually play, so I really had no problem with that. They still don't have a D-pad on the Joy-Con, which is unfortunate. But at the same time, like the analog sticks and like I said, everything else here feels super high quality when it comes to the build and everything. But before we get into the rest of the review, I do want to say and announce here that we are going to be officially having a Nintendo Switch 2 giveaway. So if you want a chance to win a Nintendo Switch 2, make sure you hit that subscribe button and stay locked in for more details on the community page. Hit that notification bell and drop a comment below on what you're most excited about when it comes to the Nintendo Switch 2 for 2025. So I'm very happy with the overall quality of the Nintendo Switch 2, especially if you compare it to the Nintendo Switch 1, the first version of that. That feels so much cheaper in comparison. Now you still have the dock as well. The dock is there. It's got a built-in Ethernet port and all of that. So those are the things that we kind of already know about it. It's a bigger dock and the system actually sits a bit higher above it compared to Nintendo Switch 1. So also keep that in mind if that's important to you. But the next thing that we have to talk about when it comes to the Switch 2 is probably the best controller of all time, and that's the Nintendo Switch 2 Pro Controller. And I'm not just saying that, it's not a cap. These smooth gliding sticks even feel better on this than they do on the Joy-Con because they're a bit longer, they have a bit more of a feel, and I'm telling you, man, you have to actually use it to see what I'm talking about. But I think one of the reasons why this is my favorite controller of all time right now, after using it for, I'd probably put about maybe 20-30 hours into the Nintendo Switch 2 already, maybe even more, is I would say that it comes with these extra back buttons, GL and GR, and they're individually can be mapped to any game, even Nintendo Switch 1 games. So for example, a game like Xenoblade Chronicles X, you can use that for the D-pad to where you can just easily swap your arts right there, so you don't have to map it through the Nintendo Switch system itself. You don't have to save profiles and all that for individual games and go in there and remap it each time and have the prompt that comes up. You can just do that individually, so that's really nice. But the buttons are thick and feel plush, plus it has a 40-hour battery life. I don't think I've charged this controller yet, and I've been using it quite a bit. Not for all of my game time because I've been playing portable mode. I've tried out the controller, like the little grip controller that it comes with, but this is by far the best controller overall that I've felt. This is the best controller Nintendo's ever made, in my opinion. And it is pricey. It is a bit pricey on there. You're going to be spending, you know, about $90 for this with tax and everything, depending on where you live or depending on the country that you're in. But if you want probably Nintendo's best controller ever made, I would say that the Nintendo Switch 2 Pro Controller is that. The analog sticks, it's got a built-in headphone jack for voice chat and everything, USB-C on the top. I also want to note one more thing here, which I actually like. There's actually two USB-Cs. There's one on the top and there's one on the bottom, so you can kind of charge it the way that you want to if you're lying down in bed and want to charge from the top overall instead of from the bottom, and it might, you know, touch you when you're on your chest or something like that. That's actually really cool too. So a number of little nice things that they did with the Nintendo Switch 2 just to make it a better system than what we got with the Nintendo Switch 1 overall. Another nice little touch with the Nintendo Switch 2 is that it's completely backwards and forward compatible with Nintendo Switch 1 controllers. So if you have the official Nintendo Switch 1 Pro controller, the official Nintendo Switch 1 Joy-Cons, you can use those with Nintendo Switch 2 games. You can also use the Nintendo Switch 2 Pro controller and the Nintendo Switch 2 Joy-Cons with Nintendo Switch 1 games as well. So that definitely helps out with not having to buy extra controllers if you have more players in the household or if you have a party or something like that. Now there are a few things here and there that I would say. Clearly, some of the Joy-Cons, there's no D-pad, right? This buttons can get kind of weird for certain games, so that's definitely not a positive. You have the 256 internal memory, which does get cut down a little bit with the actual OS and what it uses there. So you're probably, if you have a lot of digital Nintendo Switch 1 games, or if you have a lot of digital Nintendo Switch 2 games, because a lot of games are game key cards, that is going to run out pretty quickly. So you're going to have to get an express SD card. You cannot use the regular SD cards that you had with the Nintendo Switch 1, which was my bad, because before I even knew that, I bought a 1 terabyte micro SD card in preparation for the Nintendo Switch 2 before we knew about that. So then that just kind of goes to waste overall. So the micro SD express cards, those are more expensive, and they're also getting hard to find for the higher quality and more like the bigger space ones, the Lexar ones. So that's just something to keep note. You're probably going to have to be cleaning out the fridge when it comes to it until you can get a micro SD express card that's up to your level of what you want. There's 128, there's 256, there is 512, and there is 1 terabyte right now. But I will say, as time goes on, those will get cheaper, just like we saw with the micro SD cards with the Nintendo Switch 1. That's pretty much it when it comes to the actual system itself and the build quality and everything. Next up, I want to talk about the graphics and performance levels of the Nintendo Switch 2. According to NVIDIA and Nintendo, this uses a custom NVIDIA processor featuring an NVIDIA GPU with dedicated RT cores, ray tracing, and tensor cores for stunning visuals and AI-driven enhancements. Now, they've talked a lot about the 1,000 engineering years of effort across the system to design a custom GPU chip, programming interfaces, APIs, and all sorts of stuff. And that is great. You've got 4K gaming with the dock. You've got up to 120 frames per second, 1080p in handheld mode. There's so many cool different things that they talked about here. And they also discussed even how this system is 10 times stronger with the computing power over the Nintendo Switch 1. Now, I'm not sure about any of that, but all I can talk about is the stuff that we can see. Like, for example, when they say DLSS, or when they say, hey, look, you have 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second, and you see how the games look on your actual TV or the Nintendo Switch screen, and you can base it off of that. Now, clearly the Nintendo Switch 2 is not going to hit the performance levels of the PlayStation 5, despite being around the same price for a PlayStation 5 digital or something, but it does offer that hybrid mode where you have the TV and you have the portable mode, plus it comes with a dock as well included all into the package. And what you get when it comes to the graphics, from what I'm just looking at, we can talk about the specs and the RT cores and the dynamic lighting and variable refresh rate and all these cool different graphical stuff, which is definitely important and it's in there. But at the end of the day, what you see is kind of how you're going to feel about the system overall. And for a hybrid, something that you can hold in your hand, clearly it's not going to be able to match a big box like a PC or an Xbox Series X. But for what you're getting with the hybrid, I'm actually pretty impressed with the graphics from what we've seen. It is, once again, a big step above the Nintendo Switch 1, which is what I wanted overall, and it's absolutely a bigger leap from what we saw when it comes to the Wii U to the Nintendo Switch 1. The Switch 1 to the Switch 2 leap is significant and instantly noticeable when it comes to a variety of different aspects with the system. Playing something like The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom in 60 frames per second and 1440p, looking beautiful on a 4K television, in addition to the Nintendo Switch 2 screen, is just something that, graphically speaking, is awesome and so much better than what we had with the Nintendo Switch 1. It's hard not to be impressed with this little device that you can take anywhere that you want overall, and to get that type of performance, despite it being a Nintendo Switch 1 game, it looks beautiful. A game like Cyberpunk, that game looks great overall on the Nintendo Switch 2, matching some of the quality that we see with Xbox Series S and even PlayStation 5 on some levels, beating out what we see with the PlayStation 4 and the original Xbox One in that game. Or even a title like Mario Kart World, when I'm racing through that game, how the open world looks, it looks really nice. It's able to process everything in 60 frames per second with up to 24 players on there. Everything's running super smooth, portable and docked, and also other games like Fast Fusion, for example, looking fantastic. Now, once again, I'm not sitting here and saying that the graphics are the greatest or the best, and I can understand how for some people that might not be good enough, and I completely understand that. But from what I've been playing overall and what I see with my eyes in the games, I think the graphics and the performance is pretty good for a hybrid platform, especially compared to the price and what you're getting and the features that it offers. And like I said, for games that we've seen like Cyberpunk, Fast Fusion, Mario Kart World, and more that are going to be coming out. So far with the graphics, I don't have anything more to add, like a super in-depth breakdown like Digital Foundry, because that's just not my forte. I just kind of play the games and give you my assessment based off of that. But from what I'm seeing with the system graphics wise and comparing it to the Nintendo Switch 1, it blows it out of the water, and that's exactly what I wanted from the graphics and performance of a successor to the system. Also have to point out here, guys, the audio quality of the Nintendo Switch 2 is significantly better than what we saw with the Nintendo Switch 1, and a good step above what we saw with the Nintendo Switch OLED, because it now supports the virtual surround sound 3D audio, which I'll be honest, I never thought Nintendo would ever say those type of things, along with some of the other stuff like 120 frames per second on the screen itself. But yeah, the audio quality in this system is incredible and way better than what I thought it was going to be. Especially if you have some nice headphones, plug those babies in, and trust me, you're going to be in for it if you do. Next, I want to talk about the features of the system, because I think this is also very interesting how this is laid out. It's some really, really good things that people have been asking for, but then there's also some things that are not quite so good. So we'll talk about that. So features, backwards compatibility. This is probably the best thing Nintendo's done when it comes to a feature for a system in a very long time when it comes down to it. Outside of maybe the main gimmick for the Nintendo Switch 1, which was the switching back and forth, this is probably the next best feature, because the backwards compatibility with the Nintendo Switch 2 creates an instant library of incredible games that are mostly going to play significantly better or a lot better on the Nintendo Switch 2, because it's emulation and it uses the actual chipset from the Nintendo Switch 2 to accelerate things, to improve the frame rate, to make it look a little bit sharper on dynamic resolution, to do a number of things. So if you have a backlog, or if you have games that you did not play, Nintendo released 122 first-party games in addition to over 15,000 or so Nintendo Switch 1 games. Now is a great time to go back to those and pick those up. There's not the largest library of first-party games out there, or in terms of brand new games that people are going to rush out there for everyone, at least, right? There's still a lot of cool games when it comes to the launch lineup, which we will talk about, but in my opinion, the backwards compatibility is one of the strongest aspects and one of the biggest reasons to pick up the system, along with something like Mario Kart World and the games that are coming out for the year, like Donkey Kong Bonanza. Let me give you guys some examples of this. So I've been testing out a number of games. A game like Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. That game notoriously ran terrible on the Nintendo Switch 1. Well, now it runs at 4K 60 frames per second on the Nintendo Switch 2. Another game that I'll give you is without even a patch, because Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, that's a patch. But with no patch at all you got to do is just pop the game in and play. Bayonetta 3 now runs at more of the target 60 frames per second, no patch needed at all. Now the resolution still is not great. It needs a patch to get that, especially in portable mode. Dock mode, it also looks a little bit fuzzy at times too. But when it comes to what was the main issue with that game, it was definitely the frame rate, and now that is automatically and instantly fixed. Other games as well have free updates like ARMS, Super Mario Odyssey, and others when it comes to the Nintendo Switch 2, or even a game like Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. I tested that game out. Notoriously ran terrible on the Nintendo Switch 1, now runs great on the Nintendo Switch 2. Still not up to 60 frames because the frame rate is capped at 30, so maybe there'll be an update for that before Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, but right now it runs at a super locked, stable 30 frames. So areas like the Zora Domain, where the rain is coming down and there's enemies and it's just lagging and just really slowing down, that is completely fixed and makes it significantly more playable. So if you want to go back to a game like that. So to me, this opens up multiple different avenues for people to be able to play games that maybe they missed out on or didn't buy beforehand, but can now play, because the Switch 1 has an incredible library. I think it has the best, if not one of the best libraries Nintendo has ever put out. There's also games like The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. That backwards compatibility is golden, because even with that, you can get that to where it's even a more stable 60 frames per second, and they didn't even really release a patch specifically for that. They just increased it like with HDR and some graphical stuff, but for the most part, they left that untouched when it comes to frame rate, and that naturally boosts it. And that game is awesome, but it had a lot of frame rate issues in the overworld. Same thing goes for Link's Awakening. So to me, the backwards compatibility is the best that Nintendo's ever done. They've never done it to the point to where you have these type of upgrades. It's always had to be like where they say, okay, we're going to take the game and remaster it. But now at this point, they're going to do the free updates. They're going to do the Nintendo Switch 2 editions like The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, which, by the way, those upgrades are incredible if you pay for them. But even if you don't, you're going to get a solid 30 frames per second on the Nintendo Switch 2 over the Nintendo Switch 1. So even if you don't pay for the upgrades, it's still going to play better on the Nintendo Switch 2. So to me, the backwards compatibility is a huge feature, and if you played Nintendo Switch 1 and you enjoyed the system but had issues because of that, that was probably the main complaint with the system. That is completely fixed on the Nintendo Switch 2. So we have to kind of give it its shine and say that is one of the awesome things about the system overall. Now, another thing that I want to talk about is game chat. I actually got a chance to try it out portable mode with some of the elite ninjas here in the village, and it works, and I'm surprised. Some of my friends and colleagues say that, hey, look, it works. They were trying it. But what Nintendo said in the presentation, I was like, no way, right? You're not going to be able to hear anything noise cancellation. Like, even if I have Coco Melon blasting and my son is running around and screaming about different things, you're not going to be able to hear all that. And for the most part, it all works. I had Coco Melon playing. They were talking about wheels on the bus go round and round, and nobody heard the wheels on the bus go round and round except for me. Everybody else that I was playing games with, they didn't hear as I was playing Mario Kart and they were playing different games. It was, I would just say, incredible. I mean, I know that there's noise canceling, but the fact that it works as well as it does, that's just something that I would say is game changing for people actually using voice chat in the future. Because one of the things that I hate about voice chat when it comes to Microsoft and Sony and just games in general, people will have stuff in the background, music playing, all sorts of stuff, and you can hear everything. This noise canceling, and remember, I used no headset at all. I just used the built-in mic. I had no headset or anything like that, and the audio was clear coming through, and they could not hear my Coco Melon in the background. They could not hear wheels on the bus and all that. So that was actually pretty impressive overall. Now, I do want to talk about another thing here. This is probably more of a negative thing, and that is the battery life. I guess I should have talked about it more about the system itself, but the battery life necessarily is not incredible. It's about as advertised overall. It's not as good as the Nintendo Switch 1 and not as good as the Nintendo Switch OLED from what I'm seeing, or the Nintendo Switch Lite. The games take advantage of all of these advanced graphical features like the DLSS, in addition to the HDR. Obviously, the screen is bigger. It's a 1080p screen. That's going to put more drain on the system. Overall, the battery's not quite as good. Now, I am still getting the pretty much the target ranges when it comes to what Nintendo talked about there, but that's just one thing just to note compared to the Nintendo Switch 1, because this system is an improvement over the Nintendo Switch 1 in pretty much every single category, but battery life, not quite as good. Not terrible, but not quite as good. Now, there are things that you can do to improve that. So if you remove HDR, you put the brightness down or use auto brightness, you know, you turn off some of the stuff, you can definitely get better battery life, which I have tested out, and I've gotten pretty good stints well above 2 hours with certain games. But just keep that in mind that it's not going to be the best depending on what features and all of that you have set up so far. Another thing that I've had a chance to just briefly try out was Game Share, and Game Share works just, once again, like they say, on supported games. You can take a game and you can share it locally or online, depending on your connection and the other person's connection. How that works might not quite be as good, but something like Fast Fusion, for example, can do Game Share, or Clubhouse Games. It all works, and you can even do it with the Nintendo Switch 1 system as well. So the main features that Nintendo was hyping up for the system, which would be backwards compatibility, game chat, and game share, all work really well, and I think are pretty good. Now, another thing too with the backwards compatibility, guys, there are some things that necessarily don't work quite as well when it comes to every game. There are some games that have some issues, but overall, in a scope, Nintendo's done a pretty good job, and they are still updating some games to work better with compatibility and all of that for the Nintendo Switch 2. Now, I want to get into the virtual game card stuff, because that's something that it's on Nintendo Switch 1, but obviously with Nintendo Switch 2, you're going to be taking advantage of that, moving over your library and everything. And I think that the virtual game cards, once you kind of get the hang of how to do it, and if you add people into your family group and all that, if you're next to them, it works so well. You can just easily lend people games and stuff like that, or they can do it vice versa. And it's pretty cool. And it's a way to actually save a little bit when it comes to the games. There was an old method of doing it where there's like airplane mode and having your profile on another system and all that, but I never figured out how to do that very well. And I think that this is so much cleaner and easier once you actually get the hang of it. Now let's also talk about the eShop. That's also a big thing with the Nintendo Switch 2. The eShop is, or more like was, a problem on the Nintendo Switch 1. It was laggy. It did not load very fast. There was issues there. And that's kind of why I stopped going on there for a lot of stuff. I would just use the web browser or use my phone to get things because it's just so much faster on there. But not at this point. It's actually nice to browse the eShop. It's got a nice little darker tone look to it. It's got better organization. They've actually done some things to help out when it comes to the best sellers, going by revenue instead of how many units you sell, so you don't see a bunch of shovelware that discounts things down to $1 at the top of the charts overall because people are just rushing to buy that because it's only $1. So I think that that actually works better than what we had before. And the eShop is way faster as well. It's just significantly faster. You can breeze through different things. I also want to go over the Nintendo Online little app thing on there as well. That is way faster, and the organization is so nice and clean. That's also pretty laggy on the Switch 1, but on the Nintendo Switch 2, it is significantly faster and it's clean. You can see information about the past systems like GameCube and the Super Nintendo and the NES and all of that. So it's just super nice, and you can see all the games that are laid out there instead of going individually to each app on your home menu. So I actually suggest that. That's actually more of a tip, is that if you ever want to try to play a game, you can just go straight from the Nintendo Online section on the Nintendo Switch and then pick from there as well and load it up if you have the game, or you can pick it up from there. You can see the different icons and all sorts of stuff. So I do like that because it is faster, which is definitely nice because it was kind of laggy and slow on the Nintendo Switch 1. But of course, the most important thing with any system is the games. And I personally feel that this is probably the best launch that Nintendo's had in the last 20 years, or the last 3 systems or so. You have to kind of go back to maybe the Wii or the GameCube to get a better launch when it comes to first party. But overall, if you're looking at third party, I think that the Nintendo Switch 2 has had the best launch so far when it comes down to the games. There is a variety of different games. Yes, some of them are older, but they're actually pretty good games, like Yakuza 0, in addition to Split Fiction, like Street Fighter 6, Cyberpunk. You have some other stuff, like kind of weird things like Survival Kids that looks pretty cool as well, in addition to updates for other games, next generation updates, No Man's Sky, and other titles that we've talked about as well. Fantasy Life, that's another game that's also a launch title. So in my opinion, this is probably the best Nintendo's launched when it comes to third-party games. The Wii U was another system that actually had an okay third-party lineup, but the way that those games ran was actually a lot worse, or somewhat worse, than what we saw on PS3 and 360. All things considered, I think that the way that these games run on the Nintendo Switch 2 are far more acceptable and better than what we've seen even sometimes on other platforms, or on par with what we've seen on other platforms like Street Fighter 6, or at least even with the graphics like Cyberpunk, looking similar to what we see like on Xbox Series S, or even above it in some sense. So I do think that the third-party games are also looking and running better than what we've seen in the past when it comes to Nintendo systems. First party, kind of light overall, but Nintendo has had a lighter first party lineup because they like to kind of spread out the games for the rest of the year, with Donkey Kong Bonanza and Pokemon Legends ZA and Metroid Prime 4 and Kirby Air Riders and Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment and Drag Cross Drive. All of these games are coming out this year as well. So they've got more games that are going to be lined up each month in order for it to kind of spread out the releases. And I kind of like that, instead of just kind of overloading everything right there at the beginning, because there's still a lot for me to play when it comes to backwards compatibility, some of the third-party games, and of course the big marquee title, which is Mario Kart World. And I think Mario Kart World takes advantage of why you should even get a Nintendo Switch 2 in the first place. It is a massive kart racing game that you can probably play for hundreds of hours if you want to get in depth into the Knockout Tour online with your friends. It has the game chat feature and all that, where you can put yourself in the game. It's got a bunch of cool options and everything, and the gameplay is just significantly better, in my opinion, than most, if not all, of the Mario Mario Kart games in terms of the grinding and the rail riding and all of that. And with the smooth gliding sticks that we talked about with the Nintendo Switch 2 Pro controller and the advanced HD rumble that we've got, which I haven't really spent too much time on, but I can talk about it here a little bit with the Joy-Cons, the HD rumble is even better. It's got HD rumble 2, and it's more significant. Not quite as pronounced as, like, let's say, like the DualSense, for example, but better when it comes to the motors and vibrations and functions than the Nintendo Switch 1, and more pronounced in a sense. So they feel great on the Nintendo Switch 2 Joy-Cons, not quite as good on the Nintendo Switch 2 Pro controller, but it still feels better than the Nintendo Switch 1 Pro controller when it comes to the HD rumbles. So Mario Kart World takes advantage of that, and I'm sure that there's going to be many other first-party games that take advantage of that HD rumble as well. But for me, the games, when it comes to the lineup, the backwards compatibility, the eShop NSO games, stuff like GameCube, plus Mario Kart World, that being a huge multiplayer title that's probably going to get new stuff added in throughout the course of its life. I think that that is a solid launch, especially compared to the Nintendo Switch 1, where yes, we did get the incredible The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, but when you're talking about a full launch lineup for a system and how it defines the system, at least at launch, launching with Breath of the Wild is awesome, but there was no backwards compatibility, obviously. There was no NSO games at all. That wasn't ready either. And there really wasn't any big AAA games. Like, we've got stuff like Split Fiction, we've got Hitman, we've got Street Fighter, we've got a lot of AAA games to kind of supplement things for people who didn't buy it on other platforms or who want to have a portable version. Whereas on the Nintendo Switch 1, there really was just The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. I bought Super Bomberman R, there was Fast RMX, we've got Fast Fusion on the Nintendo Switch 2, so the Nintendo Switch 2 launch lineup is definitely better and actually fills in with the feature set better than what we saw with the Nintendo Switch 1. Don't get me wrong, Breath of the Wild was awesome, and that's definitely great, but as a full lineup, looking at it objectively, the Nintendo Switch 2 beats it out quite easily, in my opinion, when you factor in everything that you have access to, backwards compatibility, in addition to big first-party game, obviously Mario Kart World, other titles as well. But I will say it would have been nice to have something like the Welcome Tour game as a pack-in for the Nintendo Switch 2, because you're welcoming people to the system. I get it that it's not that expensive as a $10 experience, and there is some content in there, there is some value, there was development time put into it, but I still feel that something that's welcoming someone to the system itself and showing you the system and the features and all that should have been something that just is included in the experience, and it would have added a little bit of extra value to sweeten the deal. It's not a deal breaker at all when it comes to the overall launch or something, but it's still something that I feel that should have been a pack-in in the base Nintendo Switch, and of course the bundle as well. But overall, when it comes to my impressions with the Nintendo Switch 2, there's some things that could be improved when it comes to like the game chat feature, like not being able to add people into your group once you've already formed a group. You have to kind of exit out and then kind of do it that way. So there still needs to be some kinks worked out when it comes to some of the features and some of the things in the system. Obviously, there could be some stuff with the eShop that's a little bit better. There could be some things overall, like with the battery in terms of how they regulate that. But when it comes down to it, overall, the Nintendo Switch 2 is a fantastic system and a great upgrade over the Nintendo Switch 1. It's significantly more powerful. The DLSS in there for games makes it look way better. I think that going forward, stuff like Borderlands 4 or the 007 First Light game, that's going to be okay on the Nintendo Switch 2 and other big third-party games that they announced for the system at Nintendo Directs and stuff like that. But thoroughly impressed with the Nintendo Switch 2 so far. Like I said, a few things here and there that are not the best and need to be worked on, but overall, this is exactly what I wanted to have when it comes to a successor or sequel to the Nintendo Switch 1. Take the system, make it bigger, badder, and better in pretty much every single category, add in that backwards compatibility, launch with a consistent lineup of first-party games, get a little bit more third-party support in there, improve the HD rumble, the build quality, add in stuff built into the system, like the game chat feature, and you got yourself a system that is better than the Nintendo Switch 1 in pretty much every category. Now, one more negative thing that I will have to say is definitely the game key card situation. Yes, Nintendo has all of their first-party games on game carts, and we do have stuff like Cyberpunk 2077 on an actual game cart. The game key cards can be a little bit lame, taking up the space on your system and not including the actual game on there. So that is definitely a little bit of a negative, considering the nice third-party support that's happening, but a lot of them are game key cards. So that's also unfortunate. So I'm hoping in the future more developers actually decide to put their games on actual carts instead of the game key cards, but we'll see how that works out in the future. But overall, I don't think it takes away from how awesome the Nintendo Switch 2 is and what they can do in the future as this platform evolves. I think it's really good. But what do you guys think when it comes to Nintendo Switch 2? What do you guys think about the features, the system itself, the games, everything like that? Let me know. And once again, I will be doing more of an update on the review, so make sure you lock in, make sure you subscribe, drop a comment below on what your favorite Nintendo Switch 2 game, feature, or thing is. Of course, I will be going through, and make sure to subscribe because we do have that big Nintendo Switch 2 giveaway that will be announced on the 16th of June, so look out for that, guys. All right, thank you so much for watching. I do appreciate it. Please make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if you're someone new, click that notification bell, and we'll see you guys for the next one. Peace out.